I'm Eric. I'm the representative from the steering committee. I'm not going to do big introductions. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jessica, as the opening.
I didn't. I just want to reiterate, thank you so much for coming and spending these days with us. We're very lucky. It's turned out to be a really gorgeous day, and it's so nice. So my name is Jessica, and I'm actually from the University of Ottawa. So the drive up was beautiful. The weather was not nice there, and it's nice here, so it's so great. So I'm a PhD candidate there. However, I used to teach elementary, and I want to talk a little bit about arts-based learning. It's a very big passion of mine. When I was in elementary school, that's where it all started. I was introduced to the arts very, very early, and it was a very life-changing experience. I was fortunate enough to go to an arts-specific high school in North Bay. So believe it or not, North Bay, debatable whether it's rural, has a very strong arts community. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. So that kind of sparked the interest in arts, learning through the arts, and education. So I want to know a little bit about you, though. So I know what I had my experiences for elementary and secondary school. So I want you to take a piece of paper, if that's okay, a little bit of an icebreaker activity. Grab a magic marker, because that's how we roll in elementary school. And I want to know what was most memorable. When you think back to either elementary or secondary school, what was it about the experience overall that was memorable and that you carried with you? Now, while you're finishing that answer, I have sort of a little add-on question for you as well. We touched a little bit on this when I was introducing it, but I really want to know what you're doing now. So how did this experience that you're describing shape who you are today? What about it did you bring into adulthood? What skills did you gain from it? And more specifically, what did you learn from your engagement or your experience with arts-based learning, if your example happened to be arts-based learning? Without going into the next slide and fast forwarding past the breakout activity, I'm specifically interested in these because my doctoral thesis is actually on the student experience. More specifically, I'm doing retrospective narratives, learning about the experiences that people had in art-specific high schools, what they're doing now, and what happened in the 20 or so year span in between, and what they think they got from that experience. So this activity is kind of twofold. I actually want to know. For anybody who is finished, do you want to maybe talk about one experience or both? Talk about what it brought for you? You don't have to share. Love you too. Awesome, great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kaylee, and I work for Ontario. Oh, that didn't I'm Kaylee, and I work for Ontario Presents, which is Toronto-based, and I'm from the borough. I'm sorry, I have a cold. It's okay. The experience that I wrote down was in high school. I was encouraged to direct a show for the Sears Festival, which is a high school student theater competition. I went to a school with an arts program, and I had no thought that I could be a director. I had asked if I could maybe be involved or make a stage manager show, and an amazing teacher said, why did I direct? And I did, and was like, I'm going to do this professionally for the rest of my life. So it was super influential.
How old were you, if you don't mind me asking, when this happened?
I would say 16.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, so I got a degree in theater, and I'm looking at directing professionally now, and it's performative. I wrote down some of the skills that I gained. Definitely leadership and confidence is a huge part of that, and obviously the creative eye and being able to tell stories in a collaborative way. Actually, the collaborative process of creating theater was just hugely a part of that. Yeah, is that?
I love it.
Okay.
Does anybody want to follow up with that? Because that's a great energy. That's great. And we as well did Sears Festival, and it was the best. And I'm sad to relay that, I don't know if it is everywhere, but at least for North Bay, that's something that doesn't happen anymore. I've heard there was some stuff with Sears.
Well, Sears went.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I think
so sad.
IATSE's taken over.
So it does still exist, but not in its full original form. And also, it all depends on your particular school. I went to a school where a pair of teachers, a couple, were very committed to it, and we would do 5 Sears shows. We would enter 5 shows, which is, I guess, why they were direct, whatever. Go for it. And it was, I like to make that music. Quite a good job.
That's awesome. I love when you have that connection.
And those teachers are retired now, so I don't know what's happening.
well, you could be that person that replaces it. Can anyone build on that? Or you can have an entirely different experience. That's totally fine.
Because yeah, it was the same thing, you know, like that's where I got my, I was nowhere near theater at all. Like I was the shy kid hiding under a rock. And yeah, completely could not talk to anybody, total introvert. And one day I got a letter from my grade 9 English teacher, who was also the head of the drama department. He said, I think you're doing really good at these oral presentations in class. You should come out for drama. Now, I don't think I was doing very good at these oral presentations. But I think he recognized that if I did come out and take a drama class, I would be exposed to a different group of students, people who weren't obsessed with sports and weren't obsessed with things I didn't really care about and wasn't really good at, and that I would find people that I could connect with. So that was, for me, that was the point where I actually broke out of my shell, so to speak. You know, it's the result. I'm here. You know, now I get to play a leadership role in the arts community in Ontario. Like, how did I get here? You know, so that was that one letter that started all this.
It's crazy the impact that one small thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about the power dynamics in the environment, all of these things that are offered to you. And I'm not suggesting that this is the kettle of fish for every single student. What I'm suggesting is that this is a platform to build on for a lot of different things. If it's okay, I'd really like to hear from one more person, because I wish we could talk about this for an hour and a half.
Mine's a little different. So I'm from a small community in Northwestern Ontario. So I went to a very rural school. I graduated grade 8 with 12 other kids. And we didn't have a gym at our school. So in the winter, we would do a lot of like land-based activities in like the woods behind our school. I don't know how like okay actually like just take kids into the woods. But we made like quinzies in the wood, and like we did like these treks and stuff like that, and it was really fun. And I think it taught me about like resourcefulness, and I can see how that's helped me now working in the arts and like being able to kind of take an idea and take limited resources and build something out of that.
I love that you mentioned that, because a little later we're going to talk a little bit about the connection between the forest schools, for example, and arts-based learning, and how they're all kind of interconnected.
I just want a quick sort of thing, because the thing that I was thinking about, and I just realized this as I was going through these stories, you know, like a lot of my arts-based learning experiences were very competitive in elementary school. Like it was always a competition or an audition or this and that, and so it really catered to my competitive. I'm a competitive person. I will say that, and like it's kind of not the traditional way we view the arts as being very competitive, but it can be. And you do have to sort of foster competitiveness and assertiveness and perseverance. And that's something we totally always put towards sports, like sports realm. We think that sports foster those things, but I think the arts also foster those things really, like, at least in my experience. And I think we shouldn't like always just say that that's not part of the arts, because it is.
Well, anybody who's done a Sears competition would be on board with you. I remember like cheer on like you're going out for a sports game, like in it to win it. So and I don't think you're getting, and healthy competition is definitely good.
And I think we don't talk about that enough within the arts realm, that you know that can be a positive thing.
I agree. I find that my original sort of foray into arts was in music, and it's so structured. And again, you don't think of the arts as structured. But I found as like a really anxious teenager, it was so helpful to be able to go and have music in front of me and be able to experiment within like these parameters, and I could understand what the boundaries were, and so I found that structure really supportive. And then I think once you learn the structure, then you can kind of branch out and go your own way.
You had your hand up, I just want to hear it as well. It's nice that everybody's sharing.
My like main thing in high school was yearbook. Like I did like the digital media, because I was like, I don't want to make this image larger on a grid. It didn't agree with me. And so I moved into media arts, and it was the best thing I ever did in high school. Like I was like an anxious mess, which was great for yearbook, because you take all of that and you're like right? And that resilience that I built, like being that weird yearbook kid, whereas I was totally okay with it. I was like, whatever, you can do it, so it's fine. really important, and teaching, like when I work with my youth, teaching my kids that it's cool if they don't want to do this one thing, find the other thing that you can do, and it's like teaching them that resilience.
Yeah.
And it's like that I learned it in a really good way, I guess, and you can like translate it to the kids, I think.
All of these ideas that you guys are sharing are everything that we're going to be talking about, which is so great, from multimodal learning to self-directed learning, arts-based learning. So kind of the overarching theme is that arts-based learning, if you want to call it that, there's many different terms for what educators would use. I think children get from it what they need to get from it. It offers a lot. It's a smorgasbord. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all, and I think that's the whole point. So I'm going to move it along because I do have more stuff I want to get through, but I'm going to give in a quick little nutshell and a little circular motion. I'm going to give you some key ideas, not just from my doctoral work, but as well, I based the ideas for this presentation from an article actually that has now turned into a book chapter that I wrote with Bernie Andrews, a very talented musician and lecturer at the university. So he talks a lot about self-directed learning, specifically in music. So I love that you gave that example, because that is what the whole article turned into chapter is about the self-directed learning and how you can take something seemingly rigid like music and you can push those boundaries. You can move it to be more self-directed so that it's meaningful. You're getting the meaning out of it that you need to get. So the student experience is kind of the umbrella term that I like to use for my research and as well for the article that we have written. Some of the ideas, the main ideas that are tied into that would be like social constructivism, the learning environment, teaching and learning strategies, and power and autonomy. So I know that those sound like really big ideas, vast ideas that maybe don't connect. So I'm going to explain just a little bit further how they do connect. I put up some quotes for at your leisure if you'd like to read them, but social constructivism is definitely a really, really big one. I will only read just one, I promise. Vygotsky had said that learning is not purely an internal process, nor is it passive, but that culture and context are highly important in forming and understanding the beginnings of deep learning. So I talk a lot about, in my research about the deep learning, about the idea that for meaningful learning to happen, we can't start from scratch with students or children in sports teams or children that are coming into artistic communities. You need to build upon the community they've already created for themselves. They didn't come with an empty basket. So Bruner, for example, talks a lot about a toolkit, and he talks about the cultural toolkit that'll be packed. That's not always a pre-packed toolkit. There's a twofold with that. I'm bringing to the table right now ideas that I have and experiences that I have and that I've carried with me, but you're going to give me so much more today, and I'm going to carry that with me. So we'll talk a little more later, but Dewey talked about a continuum in learning. So the things that I'm experiencing, for example, with you today are now going to reflect my research and the things that I'm doing going forward. Just a few more quotes. I promise there's not a lot of slides with quotes, but I'll leave it up here for just a second, and I'll read just one more because I really like this. Students build upon and draw from prior knowledge, so including culture, the self, and experiences, and also utilize their own identities as well as peers as a source of knowledge. So the biggest source of knowledge that students have is each other. That's a really strong foundation, and a lot of big thinkers in education will talk about the idea that if you don't have that sort of social structure in place, and I mean we can break that down to trust, community, all of those different things that go into it, you can't build upon something that's not there. You need that socialization. And for all of you who've just given these awesome examples of learning through the arts and your experiences, I don't know if you can maybe show by a nodding of heads, but a lot of that experience was that socialization and what you got from each other. So this is really fun. This is actually something that I got from the Forest School. I don't know if you guys have heard of those, like the learning environments that are completely outside. And I love that you brought up the idea of when you were younger, talking about the forest. I am at the University of Ottawa. I travel an hour every single day to go to work. We live way outside of Carleton Place in Beckwith, in a little rural community in the woods. I strongly believe that the woods is definitely a source of knowledge, resourcefulness, everything you're talking about. There's something very different about experiencing that and being alongside nature and having free expression that way. So this actually isn't about arts-based learning, this little graph here that I want to show you. This was something that I pulled from like a Forest Valley school, a school that basically premises the idea that you would have the majority of your day outside and the children will learn from nature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I'm sure you've seen this quote before, but it's one of my favorites about, what if I fall? Oh my darling, but what if you fly? Self-doubt, I think, in the learning environment, self-doubt is major. So I think that if we can break that down for young children, that won't be as prominent for them, because I think that one of their biggest, I wouldn't call it a downfall, but definitely something that's up against them, is that self-doubt. So if they're also feeling that doubt from the environment, or not the support of their community within their classroom, that's going to perpetuate. We want to break it down, not build it. So teaching and learning and power autonomy, I kind of put all together. So these are some of the concepts that we actually talked about just through your examples that came out. The self-directed learning. So specifically in this article, we were talking about not just self-directed in learning in music environments, but evaluation. Students should have a chance to evaluate themselves and be a part of that evaluation process. I can't quite remember the quote, but talking about, you can't judge a fish if it's climbing a tree. You know the Einstein quote? It's not coming to me right now, but that I think of a lot in terms of evaluation. Because if you're having a rubric, for example, with all of these expectations that you have for children, however, those things don't apply to that child, there's no meaning making in the learning. So whether or not they've memorized it or whatever you're intending to do with them, if it's not meaningful, is it really going to stay with them? Are they going to be coming to a conference, having these conversations at this table? Oh, sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I said no way.
Oh, I love when people jump in, so I thought you were going to jump in there. Arts-based learning, obviously, is up there. So when I speak about arts-based learning, I will talk a little bit about it later. I'm talking about the transdisciplinarity of it and the interdisciplinarity of it. I'm talking about the idea that you can take these premises and spread them out across all the disciplines. I think that the biggest fallacy is that when people look at arts-based learning, they're thinking, well, obviously it must be in language class or has to be in drama class, and that's definitely not the case. I'll give an example. You could be in a science class and do a body biography. I should have brought some pictures for you guys, but we have students lay down and trace out their body, for example. And then they can take from their imaginations, we do it a lot in language, but you can do it for science too. You take from your imagination how you would picture that person looking, the idea. So you could do it with an animal, you could do it with anything. There's lots of different ways, and that's where the multimodal comes in. There's lots of ways to teach subjects. They don't have to be paper and pencil or traditional ways. So thinking outside the box, and the multimodal is great because that brings in the options. I'm saying, I need you to tell me that you know this information. Here's all the different ways that you can do it, and you might use multiple ways. Maybe you're going to do a diorama and a little skit to go with it, or maybe you're going to write a poem and you're going to create some sort of structure. So learning doesn't have to be so closed-minded. So the power and autonomy goes hand in hand. Obviously, we talked a lot about the meaning through learning. That's a really key thing for me. Realizing their potential. One of the programs I'm going to tell you really quickly, in Ottawa, well, more specifically Carleton Place Beckwith, where I live, there's a program called Be Your Best, and my 7-year-old does it. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. It is a acting class per se, but it's more, that's not what they're focusing on. All she does is put into these children's head how great they are, how strong they are, that they are standing up and they're doing this, how good they are with their community, how all these positive self-talk. So it literally has nothing to do with the poem they're reciting. Anyways, the show was a couple days ago. That's why it's so fresh in my mind. And my daughter had gotten up and she stumbled, unfortunately. She had a hard time with the lines, but everybody's cheering for her and we're talking about how awesome she is and we're like, yay! And she got off the stage feeling so proud, and we had flowers for her. She left that program with what it was intended for. And that's what I'm trying to relay with the arts-based learning. That is what you'll get out of it. So I've got one more slide, just sort of tie it all up nicely about the student experience. So maybe I'll throw it out there really quickly about how we might benefit from arts-based learning. And then before that, very quickly, I think I ran out of time, so I can't talk about the whole-minded learning, but this is a concept, I don't know if you've heard about lots of different, Gardner was one of the first thinking minds, but a lot of the great thinkers, especially in psychology, they talk a lot about the different intelligences that people have. So one of the articles that I really work tightly with talks a lot about whole-minded learning and the idea that if you want, for example, a child to be a really good scientist, you need to foster the intelligences that are prominent, the ones that are strong, for them to build up the other ones so they can work all together. So by always focusing on something that a child's not good at, like let's say, for example, my daughter, unfortunately, she doesn't like to read. So by forcing that and trying to get her to read, you're not getting anywhere, the wheels are spinning. But by putting her in this course that wants to talk about acting, there now becomes a motivator. She wanted to learn how to read so she could read that poem. So it's just thinking outside the box and trying to get all of the systems to work together. But very quickly, how do you see after this, and after the things we've talked about, how do you see arts-based learning benefiting outside of just the arts community? Because a lot of the people, for example, that I went to high school with, didn't specifically go into the arts after. But through the research that I'm doing, they've gained so much from that that made them so successful in their lives, and they're working in areas that have nothing to do with the arts. So I'm wondering if you maybe have an idea of how students, I forget where, did some of you guys say you were librarians? Children coming in? I'm so
Work in a
sorry.
library.
Work in a library?
Not a library.
I work with youth.
Youth, so
Yeah.
same idea. How would these skills transfer out?
Some of my kids came in, they're into cosplay.
What is it, sorry?
Cosplay, like dressing up as like an anime character or
Oh,
something.
fun.
It's so cool. Like they've got these great outfits. And they just want to like share an Instagram post where they are accurately representing the character that they're playing. But to do that, they had to learn how to use the camera and Photoshop. And that was fun. And they did it, but they weren't thinking about how do I use this camera. They were just doing it. And that's like, it's like finding the entry point, which was,
That's awesome.
it was such a good day.
I love that. That sounds so awesome.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that before I pass it over?
Well, I would just say that's so cool that
It
they,
is.
you know, it's not about like learning whatever artistic skill you're trying to teach them. It's like how you can use that to tell your own story of your own. Whether you're a professional artist or just living your life on Instagram.
Narratives are my jam. Narratives are my area, so I
They just
love
wanted
these stories.
all of the hashtags and all of the followers, and I was like, this is how you get it.
I still don't understand the hashtag thing. I'm such a dinosaur. I'm so sorry. You had a...
I just wanted to say I think that I really like how whole-minded learning is like harnessing energy with flexible frameworks as opposed to kind of older, more rigid frameworks, which would actually kind of allow certain people within, and then the people that aren't conforming somehow are left out.
Yeah.
And that all these frameworks are kind of there just for that consent to make it that people understand what they're agreeing to and how they're involving themselves in it, as opposed to having to change self. They see what is being offered and then they take it and they find their path. So there's I'm so happy to hear that you're doing cosplay, because it's like all my youth-based experiences were about trying to figure out like where to direct that enthusiasm and interest. And we had it at like an anime club in North Bay for several years, and that now some of those youth are like administrators and arts organizations around the province. So it's
We missed the introduction, but did you say you're from Réseau?
yes.
I gave a big spiel at the beginning. That's where it all started for me. I'm sorry.
In a
That's
good
dear to
way or
my
bad
heart.
way?
It's such an amazing community. That's where I grew up as well.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, thank you. So I will wrap this up, but thank you so much for letting me talk about this. I can provide my email after if you guys want to have further conversations or if you want to add to my research, but this is my favorite thing to talk about. So thanks for letting me come.
So I'm Tiina. I am also a PhD student, but not at the University of Ottawa. I'm at Queen's University. So my background is actually in visual arts. I'm a visual arts educator, but my PhD is actually going to be focusing more broadly on all the arts disciplines, and particularly how partnerships are formed through different organizations to support rural arts education. Now, that would have been great for me to talk about that a bit more, but as I was like organizing with Felicity to come here, you know, we were talking about translation, and then I had this, and I think because I'm in arts education, she kind of like clumped me in here. So the topic I'm going to be talking about today is not specific to arts education particularly. There is an aspect of educating and spreading awareness and knowledge through the arts, but just know that we're going to be switching gears a little bit from what we've been talking about. So this project actually was a side project I did with a professor at Queen's, Amanda Cooper. So she is in the Faculty of Education, and her specialty is knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation. So she brought me on board to do this little project, which was about arts-based knowledge translation. So we'll talk a bit, things we'll hopefully learn. What is knowledge translation? Has anyone ever heard that term before? Yes? Well, yeah, I'm not surprised.
We did conference to go together.
But yeah, so I'll talk a bit about what is knowledge translation and arts-based knowledge translation, distinctions between arts-based research and arts-based knowledge translation, variations of impact, and potential challenges. So basically, connecting it more to the rural context, which is why we're all here. The idea is that there is usually a gap that happens between knowledge and action in research, right? So you have researchers in the university and you have practitioners on the ground, whether they be educators or medical practitioners, whatever. And so they're all doing their thing on their separate sides, and how do we bring them together? So we have all this great research, but it's not being used. So that's kind of the idea behind knowledge translation. So in the rural context, for instance, you know, there could be issues, as we know, access to resources and services, food insecurity, urbanization, changing economies. So some research-based strategies, of course, that are prevalent within these studies: identifying, leveraging local assets, establishing and maintaining partnerships, empowering rural voices, communicating concerns to decision makers. So how do we take this basically and close the gap so that we have action, which could look like changes in policy, public awareness of rural concerns, enhanced networks of rural stakeholders, and localized approaches to community development. So how do we do that? So that's where the idea of knowledge translation comes in. And it goes by a lot of different names depending on where you're reading. So knowledge exchange is another one. Knowledge mobilization is a big one that we use in Canada, and diffusion of innovations. But basically all of these things mean the same thing. And they focus on the uptake of research and evidence into policy, practice, and public opinion. It's an interactive and nonlinear process that focuses on the co-production of knowledge between multiple stakeholders. So again, you have a research study, or you really want to have the best practices implemented into whatever your area is. So you would do this knowledge translation process to do that. And there's 5 basic steps, very easy to remember. So first of all, identify the stakeholders that you need to work with within your community. You involve them early on in the process. You involve them often in the process. Choose research that they can actually use, that is relevant. And by research, you know, I say research, but also, I mean, I like to use the broader term evidence, because it could be practitioner evidence as well, not simply university-based research. And also give them results that they can understand. And I highlighted this last point because this is really where the arts come in to the knowledge translation process. So arts-based knowledge translation is kind of a subset of this bigger realm of knowledge translation. And it's a process of using artistic approaches to communicate research findings to target audiences to increase dialogue, awareness, engagement, and advocacy. So what this does in comparison to regular knowledge translation, and what makes it unique, is that it allows researchers to connect with audiences outside of academia. This is a big problem. Promotes different ways of knowing and understanding, and increases accessibility of research or evidence and knowledge across cultures and languages. So I kind of pulled some examples from the performing arts. So actually, Canada is actually a leader right now in knowledge translation, and arts-based knowledge translation as well, which is really exciting. And the performing arts particularly have come to the forefront of this. So for example, I'll just pick one of these. Let's use this dance one, the second one. So for this, there were a bunch of researchers did case studies exploring the pathways that young people with psychosis take for their treatment. So what they did was a bunch of interviews with medical practitioners, with the young people seeking treatment, with their families, etc. And they did interviews, and then they handed all of this data over to dancers, a musician, and a choreographer who produced this 12-minute dance based on that. And then they presented it to over 1,000 people, which included medical practitioners, general audiences, researchers, etc. And they found that it increased public empathy and awareness around the experiences of youth. So that's the idea. So you have these experiences, or you have this knowledge that you want to translate to different audiences, and you can choose the arts to do that. So it's important, like, or just as a side note, so I don't know if anyone's like familiar with arts-based research. So a lot of medical practitioners are kind of saying that arts-based knowledge translation is arts-based research, but it isn't. So arts-based research is basically when you use the arts in the research process to gain deeper understandings of the topic that you are researching. So there is a distinction. So ABKT is different in that it may or may not include the arts in all steps of that process. So you can actually do a whole study or have evidence already that didn't include the arts, and then you can translate that using the arts, as opposed to starting a research study and using the arts all the way through. And really the important part with ABKT is that the arts are used to facilitate co-production of knowledge among stakeholders. And so in terms of impact, so a lot of studies and a lot of evaluations, as you know, like you need to evaluate a program, you want to know the impact of what you're doing, if it's having any influence on your audience. So within arts-based knowledge translation, this is important as well, but we need to kind of expand the idea of what impact means, because oftentimes the arts, as we know, don't always have observable and measurable changes. It can be an internal change as well. So we really want to expand this idea that it can be awareness to along this continuum all the way to changes actually in practice and policy. And it's on this continuum of more conceptual uses and instrumental uses, and that came from this book from Nutley, Walter, and Davies. So we developed our project with Amanda. We developed a framework to help people who wanted to engage in this process, and just basically broke it down into easy steps. And we call them steps, but really it's an iterative process and non-linear, where you don't actually have to follow it in that order. But we broke it down into steps just to make it easier to understand. So basically we've identified these four. So identifying goals and audiences, choosing art genre and medium, building partnerships, and dissemination and impact. So I'll just quickly go through each of those. So this is basically pulled from the knowledge translation literature, which emphasizes the first part of really identifying what your goals are with the knowledge translation process. So we've said that it could either be increasing awareness of evidence on a topic, debate and dialogue, increasing accessibility, increasing engagement with evidence and content, capacity building, advocacy and policy influence, and then finally partnerships and co-production. I know it's kind of a lot, but I know I kind of have to rush through. The second step would be choosing an art genre and forming partnerships. So the art genre that you choose, I mean, we're talking here about performing arts, but really you should choose an art genre that is consistent with goals and target audiences. So my example here, so if your goal, let's say, is to promote awareness of mental health concerns and self-care strategies, which are evidence-based, among teenagers, would you use, for instance, slam poetry, song, or theater? Slam poetry, is that the right answer? Because that's what I would do. There's no right answer. I'm just asking like what your opinions are. Why would you choose that?
I find slam poetry super, super powerful and channeling. So I don't know if you've ever seen slam poetry in action. It is. You're right. It's super intense.
Just like teenagers.
Yeah. And you can feel their pain and whatever they're trying to express. You're like, I feel it too. I'm gonna cry. That's good.
Any other ideas?
Seeing it, it impacts in different ways, in different
It's also new and fresh, like theater as in the genre is kind of done deaf, it's like you have to really struggle to sort of bring a fresh approach to that. Whereas slam poetry, you've got an emerging genre, you've got something that's very cutting edge. There's a lot less, for lack of a better term, baggage that comes with that.
And I like that, so, as you're talking, I can hear already that you have the teenagers in mind, like you want to catch them with something that's fresh. You said there's like that teen angst that's like kind of goes into it. So that's the point, is that you need to choose an art genre according to your goals, first of all, so, promoting awareness and self-care strategies, but also your target audience, which would be the teenagers in this case. What is going to hook them? And then, who would you need to partner with, do you think? in this process? Or who are the various partners in this process?
Local mental health resources.
Yeah.
So those are mine.
Yeah.
Would you want to maybe get an artist in there, like someone who, for example, writes slam poetry, like just to model
For sure.
a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe the teams themselves
Yeah.
to see if that's something they're interested in.
Yep. So it's like and those are all right answers. You know, there's no wrong answer to that either. But definitely, you have to think about who are the various partners. Like, it's not just like I'm going to stand here with no experience of slam poetry and be like, I'm going to do this with teenagers. You know, like I would need to find someone who actually has experience in this. I would need to engage maybe the mental health professionals, in addition to the research maybe that I've already done. And yeah, talking to the teens, maybe their parents, et cetera, to get as many people involved as possible and get them involved early, like I said.
I just make a comment on that. It's interesting because in terms of the mental health professionals, and sometimes it's just about the art.
Yeah.
And one of the best meetings I had was with Davidson, and he's at CHIO, right, who heads the Center for Youth Mental Health. And they opened a little art space across from CHIO. And he said, and I've seen it, he said, actually before, what's my word, identifying with the youth or issues, do the arts. Then 6 months later, don't even include the mental health. 6 months later, come back and then do the assessment, and it will be a different assessment.
Is it because it'll emerge anyways through the arts, or do they think it's going to kind of course correct through working through that?
Well, I've seen it, and I just, the kids come in non-labeled, for one thing. I think that's a big thing. Artists just see them as creative youth, and that's huge, and I've seen that decrease incredibly. I think that's one big thing, and then they find their place and their roots. And I mean, there's also a lot of our youth that fall through cracks, very much our creative youth that don't have a place. So it's interesting for me to see it, but for Sam Davidson to say it, you know.
Yeah.
So it's just,
Okay, cool.
yeah.
And then finally, we have assessing impact. Like I said, this is very important, and it's not done enough in knowledge translation initiatives. Even in like the regular realm of knowledge translation, it's very difficult. So we've kind of put these metrics that can be used to assess, but we want to emphasize as well that this doesn't necessarily need to be the goal, you know, to like look at these metrics. Really, it's a focus on the process and among the co-production, like I said, of knowledge and understanding among the different stakeholders. But again, we live in this kind of measurement-based world, I guess, where you do have to sort of provide evidence that you're having some sort of impact. So to help with that, we've developed this, which comes from the knowledge translation literature in health. So impact categories could mean reach indicators. So that could be something like number of resources distributed, Google Analytics data, et cetera, et cetera. Partnership and collaboration indicators, so that could be a number of products and performances developed or disseminated, and type and capacity of the building efforts and network growth and things like that. Usefulness indicators, so in the example I just gave, if you're trying to promote these kind of strategies among youth, you might want to talk to them and see, if they're satisfied with, or if they find that process useful, if they gained any knowledge, or if their views have changed based on the initiative. Practice program or service indicators, so that could be like the commitment, like how many of your partners have committed to change, or your audience members have committed to that. Observed changes, reported changes, and then finally, policy and advocacy indicators. So that would be documentation, feedback, process measures, et cetera, et cetera. And possible challenges that are associated that we've identified with this process. So first is quality control and artistic integrity. And I love that you asked, like, maybe I should put an artist in there. We actually feel like that's really important to have a professional artist involved in the process. Again, like if I have zero experience like in dance, I'm not gonna like decide to like choreograph something and put on a performance, like I would involve someone who actually knows what they're doing. And the artistic integrity is really important. And the great thing about this too is when you're involving artists, and if you have funding as a researcher, that creates opportunities for artists, to spread their knowledge and also to make a little money.
Yeah.
Finally, the next one. So assumptions of art and art making. So in the arts world, we tend to think like the arts are amazing and this and that, and like everybody's gonna love them. But But we have to also remember that maybe that is not always the case. You know, you have to consider your target audiences and who you're working with. Like maybe they don't see the arts the same way that you do. And so you have to kind of like place yourself like, you know, be aware of your bias and how you see art making and how it's different from your audience members. Clarity and reach of the message. So again, with this, a lot of it is focused on really sending clear messages out to audiences, which is why in knowledge translation and arts-based knowledge translation, theater has been used a lot, creative writing has been used a lot, poetry, things where you can actually relay a clear message. So visual arts hasn't been used as much, nor has dance, because again, you can kind of get mixed messages in there. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just depending, again, on what your goals are. So if it's to actually, you know, increase awareness and knowledge of something specific, maybe you don't want to, like, you know, involve a painter who's going to make an abstract painting based on research evidence, because it's not going to give the knowledge. However, if you might have that person on board if it's more about just that personal awareness, or just like changing views or something like that, or to engage in dialogue and discussion. And finally, gathering impact data. So the way that you gather impact data should also reflect your goals and should reflect the art genre. So for instance, if you are putting on a play, what are some ways that you think you could gather impact data? How do you know if you're having
Like,
influence?
maybe like a small survey that you had at the
Yep. Any other ideas?
ticket sales.
Your ticket sales, yeah.
Yeah.
People are
So people
show
gonna
up,
go,
yeah.
Yeah. Again, so like, I like the idea of the ticket sales and the survey. You might have, again, the little workshop afterwards with a few focused participants. I mean, there's no wrong answer again. It's just like, but also as many different ways as you can would be great. But if you had to choose one, you should choose the one that is most related to your goals. And also, you know, if you're putting on a play for, you know, 500 people, it's going to be hard to talk to each and every one. So a survey might be a good thing. You leave it on the seat, or you have an online survey with a link that people can go and just kind of fill it out. So you have to consider that. So the questions that I will leave you with, we have a few minutes, I think. Is that the right time?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, lots of minutes.
We have lots of minutes. So my questions and considerations within this process was, how might ABKT be useful in your context? What challenges do you foresee? And also, this is an important one, I feel, how might we bridge the gap between artists, researchers, and other stakeholders in this process? Because there tends to be gaps between those areas.
Just quickly, only because I do use arts-based research and continuously through, I loved the idea that that doesn't have to be as consistent. So for someone, for example, who's maybe trying it out and that's not really your area of research or whatever it is you're using it for, you can kind of try it out without making that commitment, because once you make that commitment, you need to stick with it.
Yeah. Like I said, you know, it could be a case like, I mean, in our environment in academia, you know, a lot of times you'll have just like a traditional study. So then this is an opportunity to take that traditional study and try and get it out there in a different way.
Just the one thing that we haven't done very well actually is gather like theses from PhD students, and especially in my area of children and youth in the arts. And so, you know, we need to find places that we actually can get that up, and that way then, you know, both sides, and we've lost an enormous amount of knowledge by not having done it.
Yeah, because also with
20 years.
PhD theses, like not all of them get published,
Yeah,
for
exactly.
instance, into articles. Like you have like all of these books lining up in these libraries of dissertations that have just, they're collecting dust and they're not being used.
And that really gets, then the artists have a place to go, and then they start to talk to each other with the researchers. And, you know, that's something with CNEL and Nancy and we need to really start looking at.
Yeah, I think that's an
together.
interesting thing that you talk about the organizations, and that's where I was looking for the gap. It's one of the roles I think reflects now in SPARC
Absolutely.
can play
Yeah.
in that making those introductions,
Yeah.
making those connections,
Yeah.
you know, between what are often two very different worlds.
Because I know like CNEL is affiliated with Queen's, like Larry Farrell and Ben Bolden, but so that's why they were trying to, they identified this problem too, where, you know, their organization is kind of viewed as this academic-based organization, and they want to try and change that. It was like, how do you change that, you know, and create more partnerships and different ways of getting the knowledge out there, because a lot of their knowledge is research studies that they just kind of post on their website that nobody's going to read, you know, unless you're trying to like make a case for funding or something like that. So, yeah.
But I think by having supervisors, professors, etc., that maybe think outside the box, that's a step in the right direction. Like just as an example, my dissertation is not typical. It's going to be published as a book. But you need to have that support from your team, like your committee. So if they're not on board, that's not happening.
Yeah. Yeah, and what was it? I just ran into one of the PhD students who's from Thunder Bay, and I've been following definitely Superior over the years and what they're doing, and she's actually writing a PhD thesis around them. So, you know, for them to have that knowledge, which helps support funding, for me to know that knowledge actually is out there and it's been, you know, it's been written, it's just huge. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done that.
Yeah,
That's a really good point.
Pardon?
That art gallery is awesome.
I know, and I just love Laura.
Laura Northway?
Yeah.
Yeah. She is awesome.
She's awesome.
I did also read a study on how, for funders, you know, because you often have to give these presentations, these dry PowerPoint presentations for funders a lot of the time with like numbers and stuff. So I can't remember exactly what the context was, but they made a quilt, actually, like had all of these, oh yes, I think now it's coming back to me. It was healthcare workers working with fetal alcohol syndrome patients. And so those healthcare workers each made a quilt of like the experiences or something like that, and they gave that to the funders, and it was actually really powerful, and they were more impacted by that quilt than they were by, you know, all of these numbers, and you know, so you kind of need to have both. Like they like to know the numbers and the impact indicators, but you can have something like that as well in addition to that that can really help your case too. Multimodal. Yeah.
Yeah, and they like the stories. They didn't used to, but now they do.
Yeah, which is why this is, I think it's building in Canada. And it's really fun.
In mine and Brittany's program, journaling is a big part of our data collection, which is a challenge.
It is
hard to journal every day.
Yeah.
It's hard to journal weekly sometimes.
The teens were angsty again.
Yeah. But I find that really helpful too.
Yeah.
It helps me like work through my thoughts and as well as get some
Do the teens journal as well? Like, do you compare the journals?
No, just the
we
leads
journal
journal.
about like our experiences. I actually, I forget to journal all the time. I just like talk to my dog when we're on lawn. Works the same.
Should have a recorder going, you know? Like,
Steve, I think our coordinator Steve takes like always notes so that we have field reporters, but taking like that deck, like more qualitative data and giving that to our research lady, she has to go sift
She
through
could
all of
transcribe it if you just.
Yeah, she goes through all of it and picks out
The trends or whatever.
yeah, she translates the inner commentary of our mind into like useful information.
That's so cool.
I think we're doing a good job.
Anyway, that's my spiel. I'm going to move on since we're going to be out of time, but thank you.
That was amazing.
So mine is totally different, and it's very much about growing a sector, and something that a lot of us have been working on for sort of the last 20 years. And I'm Linda Albright, and my quick little story is I'm from a rural community. I'm from a rural community in Southern Ontario, and I started with actually restoring two old train stations to be an art center, visual art center, over 15 years. But it was interesting because the same kids that we saw were the same kids that the theater saw. And you know, 5,000, it was about the same 200 kids and their families that supported them. So where's the other 5,000? In the late 1990s, there was a lot of work being done on the importance of arts for youth at risk. And a lot was coming out of the US. And so it was, how do we start thinking about different ways to program and how do we start thinking of ways to engage? And I wasn't the only one. It was really interesting. I don't know what happened in the late 90s, but there was a group, a small number, about 5 or 6 women across the country that were thinking the same thing. So Carolyn Driekus at Arts Umbrella in Vancouver, Wanda Coop in Art City in Winnipeg, Phyllis Novak at Sketch in Toronto, you know, and actually most of them came on as founding members of ANSI. And I thought this would be easy. I thought, wait a minute, you know, we're in communities, why can't we grow the arts and programming? It's been the hardest thing, I just want to say that, ever. So anyway, so hopefully this will just click. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm going to have to do this one, aren't I? Right, the button. Okay. So it was very simple from the start. It was really looking at the overarching community and how do we have a larger percentage of children having access to arts and youth. Where does art happen? And for sure we're seeing art centers in communities. Very hit or miss, and you've talked about in schools and where that's happening. We're seeing a lot where it's bridging arts in schools and arts in community, and you know, artists are the center going into schools so kids see them, and then it's easier for them to come to that space. And I'll talk a little more later, but there's some innovative ways that schools, especially right now in Ontario, are starting to partner with arts and spaces. And then churches are starting, especially United, Lutheran, and time here, the Anglican Church. So we're seeing a lot of youth things happening, not as faith, but as a place to go to really be engaged in the arts. And then a large growth in libraries, immigration, health, justice, correctional, a lot is happening in correctional service facilities and social housing. People always say to me, what age are you talking? And I go, 3 to 30, really easy, early years to young emerging artists. And I'm not going to speak to all of them either. We've seen a lot of work around youth-led organizations, but people have to start recognizing that it starts with youth engagement, you know, and we grow with them. We're seeing a lot around youth changing, arts for social change, youth arts entrepreneur programs, and we're starting to see more of those. And I was just talking yesterday with Brian Beltmeyer in Nova Scotia, and he formed that organization, and it was specifically to work with young emerging artists. He's worked with fashion designers and dancers and, you know, videographers, and that's really growing. I've used that word scaffolding because we're starting to use that term, and it's that ability to go from organization and organization. I was in Toronto at a meeting, and two organizations, Manifesto was there, from Manifesto, and another one I didn't know, but they were talking about one specific girl who went over to Manifesto and she grew in her arts administrative skills. And then the next organization took her because she was in hip hop and she was heading into being professional. So, you know, they took her down to LA and started working with her there. But one from Urban Arts nudged me and she said she came through my door at 11. So, you know, how can we work as organizations to encourage that? And we say scaffolding because they may step off at some place and stay right where they are. So, arts experiences, the one I still use is less than 25% of youth ever have had an arts experience outside of school. And that's the Search Institute in the U.S. and it's not just specific to Canada. We did it in New Brunswick. It was less than 17%, and I would say that's very much and not specific to rural. It's probably in Scarborough. There is not a youth creative space in all of Scarborough. They're all downtown Toronto. So, you know, as we look at neighborhood spaces, there is a higher percentage though in Indigenous communities because the elders really are working hard to integrate and teach the traditional skills to young people. So that comment of, I think because this is a performing arts and a lot of money has been spent on audience development, and if we can get youth into theater to see it, you know, then we'll get them as audience. But as Bill Poole said, see it and do it, and I believe that. So the more that we can actually get them doing it, will really increase the audience development. Making the case, and you've talked about some of that already, the interest in job creation for artists. The one, because this is a rural conference, it's interesting. Cultural industries, as we know, is growing. It's the fastest growing sector in Canada. But because of high-speed internet now in rural communities, we're absolutely able to see young animators, filmmakers, you know, music engineers go back to raise their family in rural communities and work with the company in downtown Toronto, Montreal, Nova Scotia. So anyway, so that I really use that when I'm talking to rural funders. You've talked about arts-infused education. I won't spend any time on that. This is ArtSmart. So ANSI has a connection with ArtSmart. The head office closed, but we sort of took over their all of their stuff. So it's good. We don't have a lot of funding for it, but we have good partners across the country. So it's a national art-infused education program that still is staying alive across the country. And again, the audience is schools and communities, and that's the typical one, you know, bringing students to the museum. But as I said, there's a lot of programs, and Holly Cunningham is here from And she was doing very much, we're seeing some pilot projects with higher risk students of dropping out with community arts organizations, and she has one of those. And I've seen that in two other, Welland's doing the same thing, and there's something happening with their community out there right now. So if we don't get the same government back in, it may change enormously, but it will cost our fingers. And then the conservatory style class, which is typical. And then for ANSI and for me, the interesting piece is, what are those new emerging programs and what do they start to look like? And I do really push for that idea for children and youth creative spaces. And I'll give you a couple of pictures in a second. But, and then some are single discipline and some are multidiscipline. And when I started, one of the first groups was in Strathroy, Ontario, and someone said, you should see what this, we don't know what he's doing down there, but something's happening. And it was a storefront. And there was a stage in one corner, a recording studio, and a multimedia studio, and he would say the kids come in, they perform, if they're good enough, they get to record, if that's good enough, they get to, go up and design their CD, and suddenly 2 years have passed, and, people realize they've been engaged. So we're definitely seeing more of that happening. They're still not very sustainable financially. And then Youth Arts Center. And then there's a lot of new work, and I'll talk about it if there's more time later, where arts are starting to take place in non-arts organizations. So we're seeing them in recreation, we're seeing them very much in health centers and correctional. And my last slide, if there's time, I'll talk a little more about that. But I think it's a statement in the creative spaces. It's, a place to belong, especially in rural. Place where they can be creative and no one's watching them. And I do believe strongly that you have good artists. They're people that believe in the kids, and it's amazing how they just grow. And it's, those are very simple, basic things. They're starting to realize in terms of healthy youth development that they need places to belong, people that believe in it. And artists can do that. So for any of you, I don't know, do any of you know Art City in Winnipeg? You know Art City in Winnipeg. So again, 20 years ago, Wanda Coop was on CBC, and my friend told me, you should listen to this lady on CBC. And again, we all come from rural, so we have an arena in every community, and this is not a sports versus art thing. It's just a reality check. And so, yes, across the road from every arena does need to be an art city. And another program that's interesting always has been the Spiral Garden model of Toronto, which is Arts Gardens and Play. And again, a lot performance-based. Does any of you know the Spiral Garden? Okay. It's not as large as it was. It was with the Bloorview Macmillan Center, or the Bloorview, one of the hospitals, the rehab hospitals, but they did summer programming. So it was really transforming an outside space. And it was really the youth that created it and kept building it over the years. So the art that happened in it, a lot of storytelling happened, a lot of dress-up happened, a lot of creation happened. And it's a great model, and they actually produced a book. So, and it's gone into second print. So it allows us to really use that. And I'll talk about that later. Outreach programs. We are seeing a huge growth in outreach programs. This is the Bajuji Theatre, and it's a really old picture of them. But they were one of the first theatre companies that were really starting to go into northern communities and do outreach work. There's a lot more happening today, and we're seeing a lot of musicians going in all the way up. And I just had breakfast this morning with a man who is on one of the exploring ships, which is the tourist ship, and he's there as the artist, and they are stopping at some of the remote communities along the northern coast and working with them, leaving materials. A lot. You're with so you're working with Elan in Quebec, and you will know Katie Green.
Yes.
Yeah, so the work that Katie is doing, and they're being hired by the Cree First Nation of the James Bay Coast in Quebec to actually be going into schools, and they've taken equipment with them, and
everyone should see this program.
Yeah, they're really
phenomenal.
Great.
No, so it's called Mukcham, and it's funded by the Cree School Board. So Katie Green is heading it along with Melissa Leto and David Hodges, and like it's like they've been around now for almost 3 years doing this work, but like the impact that it's had is unbelievable. You see their videos like through their website and stuff, and the music videos that these youth are producing. They're spreading actually across Canada, and it's
Great.
It's
and we've seen over the last 20 years a large number, and Clayton left on this, but but I want to say we're getting to that tipping place, and I had this conversation with Penikuchi, where in fact there has been knowledge built because of these organizations that have gone into community, that knowledge is staying with those communities. So there's becoming this tipping point that there's been capacity that has started to build in those communities. And we now need to start reversing some of that trend in those that have built. And I was at so many conferences this fall. Blueprint for Life, that's gone in and out a lot to do with hip hop, and he brought one of the Inuit youth down who did spoken word beatboxing with throat singing, Inuit throat singing, and merged those two together. But he's been working with Blueprint for so long that he now can lead those programs in his home community. So I think we're at that place as well. And everything, Art Gallery of Nova Scotia's done a lot of early years programming in rural, and then we're seeing large TIFF and National Art Gallery doing work. And then I love the near North Media with Foley. And I think she's really laid, a good model for that to be expanded across the country. So to figure out. This is where I'll talk arts and non-arts community. We're definitely seeing more things happening. This is Thunder Bay. This is KHAB. And often I get Boys and Girls Club will say, how do we do more arts within Boys and Girls Clubs? And I'll say, well, think about it. Next time you need to hire a child and youth worker, why don't you think about hiring a community artist? And suddenly I'm starting to rethink that. So I think especially within Boys and Girls Clubs, they're starting to hire more artists, they're having new equipment, they're having recording studios, multimedia studios. Those aren't often in rural communities, but we're seeing that growth. The area that's interesting is, and a little challenging for us, is that we're going to see a huge growth within record community centers. And the challenge that we're having is that they don't actually use artists to deliver programs. So it's, who's the easy recreational staff that we can use to deliver the music program. And my daughter, my 2-year-old grandson to the music program, and actually the mothers came back the next session, with real meaningful, instruments and things. So I work a lot with Canadian Parks and Recreation and help write the strategic plan for Canada for recreation. For the next 10 years, they wanted to put arts under recreation. But we can't do that. And but we have an opportunity to work closer with them. I sit on something called Playworks Partnership, which is provincial, Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, a few other organizations, and so we just really have to keep best practices out there, and in a way find a way actually to certify. If you're a good community center, it means that you will have artists delivering that work. So. But anyway, so I think that's where we have to go next. And there's a few really good examples. The Roundhouse in Vancouver. It's actually culture that is embedded. There's the culture department, but it's also embedded in Parks and Recreation. So this is a little stage. It's quite an old picture, but I have 2 reasons to show it. It was also a group out of a small community in north of Montreal, and they would send youth out much like Holly does with a band in the summer and go to rural communities and stop making jamming, making drums and art making drums. But I have another little story about this because Playworks Partnership about 10 years ago had $40,000 from the Ministry of Health to do micro grants to communities. And youth had to apply, and it was across the province. So we expected 40 or 50 applications. We had over 400 applications. And so I went through them all, and what was amazing to me was the high percentage of youth in rural communities that were asking for arts. And the one I loved the best was the one that said, people keep giving us ping pong tables, but nobody's played ping pong for 30 years, so we really want the money to buy some djembe drums so we can start a djembe club. I mean, it's as basic, as simple as that. And so that's, that was really interesting, and it was really interesting for Playworks to see. And we have that as a bit of research. We treated it as a research project in the end. and I am passionate about children and youth creative spaces. And this is actually Sketch in their old facility in downtown Toronto. Does anyone not know Sketch? Do you all know Sketch? Do you know Sketch? Okay. So they're an organization very specific to youth, sort of 14 to 29, that is very much involved with street and homeless youth. So they will see 400 street and homeless youth. And my office was with Sketch for 8-9 years. So it was great to be able to be there and to listen to youth. I mean, there's still a lot of listening for 20 years. And a lot of those youth came out of rural communities. In fact, my next door neighbor, you know, was a great kid. And once her parents started shutting down theater for her, you know, and other activities for her, she just ended up on the streets. You know, she ended up in Toronto and she ended up at Sketch. So, but I show this picture because I could see it do it but help build it. So Sketch has always made a point of having youth, hiring a carpenter, and having youth work. And at my training stations, I did that a lot. And I would hire them at youth with justice hours or high school community hours. And it was amazing how attached they became to that building. And when we came back a couple years ago, remember me, we want drywall in the basement. So I always push for that. This is another short one, again in rural communities. They don't have to be huge. This is actually Whitehorse, but it's a Quonset hut. So very rural, that's all it was a Quonset hut. And this day, all of the First Nation youth came from 13 First Nation communities to do a collaborative project. But you see, kitchens are really core-centered to a lot of what we're seeing as new creative spaces. And they are here, and then they have a little art gallery, but room for dance. They do a lot of music there, a lot of music recording there. This actually is the old Sketch space. They're in a whole new space now at the Shaw Gibbons School. But you can see the kitchen was central, a small jamming area. At the back they had the recording studio, and they had a multimedia studio.
Yes. Is the kitchen, is it the socialization of being in the kitchen and preparing food? Like, what is it about the kitchen?
It's all three. No, it's all three. Is it culinary arts?
That's what
Is it nutrition? Or is it socialization? Like, it's all of those things, right? We sit down as a family to eat. And I'm going to talk in a minute about my Participate program, and that was a really core piece of that. And a lot of the youth are Sketch. So what would happen if youth were very interested in this specific area, they would become the assistant to the carpenter, to the music engineer, to the cook. And a lot, I would say, where did so-and-so go? And he goes, oh, he's over at George Brown now taking the chef course. You know, and this is, so again, that's those entry point places, and where we can scaffold them, we keep taking them. So yeah.
Food is really important as well.
Food is really important.
In creating an inviting space, you know, for youth that aren't very comfortable, particularly with the arts. You know, like if you, one community that I worked in the north, it was just like I had to have food with everything.
Yeah.
You know, because that was just, you know, we start off just by getting a snack and talking in a circle, maybe not about anything arts related whatsoever, and then like eventually you just bring it in, and then it's like, okay, now we're comfortable, we can try it. And I think it's such an important tool. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, no, and you talked about entry point, and I'll use that in another slide, but you know, some kids as an entry point that never experienced the art would sit in the kitchen and chop carrots, because that was their safe place in the moment, right? And then it would take time to sort of enter. So it's multiple things, but I'm passionate about that. And so I don't know if I said this in my initial, when I decided there should be more work and we should look at programming, and my brain was not going to one program because I spent 15 years at the station and I knew it had to be a larger conversation. So particularly only Southern Ontario. And then I met with Canadian Heritage and Robert Lucier, who's Director of Arts Policy, but you need to think national. I'm going, Robert, I have $20 in the bank, give me a break. And because he said, no one's having this conversation. What does art look like outside of schools, right? So that's how we became local. But my mayor in the community said, why aren't you thinking about doing a pilot here? Do that. But we did, and it went on for almost 14 years, and I don't resent a minute of it, because between there and Sketch, I had an opportunity to always observe and watch youth, and we had an opportunity to use the best practices of the other organizations and sort of merge it. So it's really good, became a really good rural model. And we were the rural site for the National Youth Arts Demonstration Project out of McGill. You know that researcher piece, Albright. So she did 5 organizations across the country. Our place was pretty simple. It was just an abandoned space upstairs in the mall, you know, that was office space, and we turned it. So I show this because of the size of the space, but behind there was a stage, and over there was a kitchen and a visual arts space as well. And this is, we did a lot of work over the years. We did early years programming, we did arts, gardens, and play, and I'll show you a picture. We did a curriculum base, and that's the one we did with McGill, which started with food. You know, again, it wasn't come right into a theater class right now. It was very holistic, it was very community arts based. Entry point of coffee house with students, kids that had never been on a stage before. And you almost have to do 2 coffee houses, one for those kids and one for the ones that are really great musicians. We did theater, we did a little bit of everything over 12 years. And we saw hundreds of youth go through, thousands of youth. It was crazy. And this was our version of the Spiral Garden model. And it was just this funky little garden behind the racetrack. And actually I went, look, it's still there. People are still maintaining it. Because Spiral Garden said people will vandalize it if it's out in the open. And we had just the opposite. People would bring things, people would leave things, kids would go back to it, young people would hang out there. But we took all of our art supplies there for the summer. And that's where we did all of our work. So, and early years daycares would come, which was so awesome. The entry point of programming, if you have never had that arts experience, and I see a lot of that, and we did a little mini programming rather than Fort Loring, and I went into the first day thinking, oh, we're going to jump right into some arts engagement things with these kids, and one little boy said, I only play soccer. No, I only play soccer, and I realized we really had to take it right back to a very simplistic place of somewhere that they understood. So, so I do show this, and back to the scaffolding. Really basic, we just did haunted houses. There's not a high arts discipline, high arts standard on that, but it was what got kids through the door and excited. And we had the mall kids, and then suddenly, because it was good, you started to have the drama kids from theater, from school to show up. So this is Aaron, and he came through the door just to play poker, by the way. And that's another whole story. But after a while, he started getting the junk jewelry out, you know, and putting it on their caps, and it was that transitioning over to start to be performance. So from there, you know, we took a bunch, and we then gave them the opportunity to be out at the Community Playhouse Theater, and we chose to do Wizard of Oz. So suddenly you had the staff from, or not the staff, but the people from community theater that were helping mentor them. My son came in, he was a York University grad, and he did some work with them. And so suddenly you did start having professionals come in and work with those kids. And he did Wizard of Oz, and what was interesting, so a kid who'd never acted in his life, and we did an open audition for it. So the Lion was actually a summer professional artist for summer shop theater. But you know what? The Lion was Aaron. So and we saw a mix of kids that would never come together, and 10 minutes. But there was another interesting story about that where in Parkdale Community Centre in Toronto there was a multimedia lab, and it was low income. They were bringing it to the city, and they would come in and create film, but then they were able to show it at the AGO, you know, and you had these kids and they were on radios going to the AGO. So again, it's how do we keep giving them these opportunities to keep rolling it. My son was like you, he was very shy and he hid behind chairs. And one of the things Tilsonburg does do is they've had a youth-led theater. And so every spring they have their own executive, they choose the performance they're going to do, they do it in August, and kids cycle through, and Ian just hid behind chairs. And I sort of wish there were more performing people in this because a lot of community theater don't really want to work with kids. It's their plea, it's
so much work.
It's a lot of, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I know a lot of community theaters, they have that one person who wants to do it. Yeah. And if they're doing it, that's great, but everybody else,
they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so how do we bridge that place? But for Ian, it was huge because he was one they adopted, you know, and they said, oh, come run sound for us, you know. And then he built that experience, and then he started doing, he did Sears Drama Festival, and then he applied at York, and they said, your marks don't even hit our radar, you know, but look at your portfolio. built, and however we can get rural communities to allow those opportunities is huge. And now he is actually the director and the operations manager, technical director at U of T in the film and theater and opera and the music program. So that would never have happened, and without Chelsea Little Theater. So sort of quickly at the end, they asked sort of, what's a scan of just rural Ontario? Please jump in any moment.
Hi everyone. I'm really sorry that I had to step out, but when one of your colleagues calls multiple times or texts you saying it's an emergency, just go and take the call. Right? So I'm very disappointed that I had to miss this, and I'm simultaneously happy I was able to solve someone else's
You can
problem.
totally do that. So basically, we look at that less than 25% of youth have an arts experience outside of school. It is so real. Although, like I did say, it's higher in Indigenous communities. Big time, and those are the stats, and we need to say that. But traditionally, urban, rural, it's not. Though we see a lot of the formal. We're seeing some choirs, we're seeing the traditional music class, we're seeing those types of things. We do see children's theater camps in the summer for sure. Some of the youth-led performance. Kingston is our only one in Ontario, and that's where they set aside a week, and you talked about it last night, where kids can audition, and it's not one performance, it's multiple performances through the week in different places. And I didn't mention, but I also founded National Youth Arts Week. I don't know what National Youth Arts Week started about 7 years ago. Oh yeah, Clayton went to the Peace First Nations. We have not had funding for the last 3 years, but in the first 2 or 3 years,
I love that you're saying that laughing. It's so humble, I love it.
yeah, I don't talk. So the first 4 years we had really good funding. We were able to give out almost $200,000 to youth. We had over 1,000 activities across the country in over 80 communities with over 40,000 youth. And those are just the numbers we could get. We don't even know the ripple numbers that really did the organizing of it. So sadly, because I can't get any youth fit the evaluation criteria of Canadian heritage, that I have to get them to sit at a computer and tell them how good it was. Out of 40,000, I maybe can get, as I said, 14. So anyway, Canadian heritage aren't doing, but it has gone viral. It's not going to stop. There's a lot of places that don't know about it, but there's pockets. Winnipeg, Waterloo, Vaughan, Mississauga, they're all doing it. So I am continuing to look for funding, and I have other strategies around that. But and then community engaged art, so we're seeing, and that's Robin Sutherland with, King Rock and others, Reiki maybe. And then of course the big one is the touring companies that are going across the province. And we talked with the girls last night, we need to actually begin a database of who is going out there touring and which communities are they coming into, because it may be only the school that knows they're there, but not the municipality. So I'd really like to see that, and we'll put in some collaborative partners to create that kind of technology, because we can just triple the number of performances and training. So what I get often asked for is in rural communities, for those touring, can they actually stay and do a workshop, right, with the artists that are working in those communities, and not, so we'll work on that. I just put the film and photography. I was, again, back at Playworks, and Playworks does these youth-friendly community awards, which aren't qualitative or quantitative. It drives me crazy. But at least on the application to be a youth-friendly community for the first time in rural, the arts are there, as opposed to just sports. And I was in a session, in Newtown, a couple months ago. And 30 communities from all the way to Petawawa to Manitoulin came, and they were all youth workers. And the first question was, can you tell us one really positive experience that you had on a project with youth? And out of those 30, only 3 could do that. And it was crazy. And these are people who are in charge, and they're being funded to do youth engagement. And 2 of them were arts-based. So one was working with Sherry Chichu on Manitoulin, the film, right? She did a film project with youth that had a really good response, and another was a photo voice project. So you feel like you sort of keep beating this one on the importance of it, but So that's what's happening, but there's potential for so much more growth in rural communities. This is my last slide, we're 2 minutes. I started with saying it's a framework and a blueprint because what we've gathered over 20 years is a great deal of knowledge, and not just ANSI, but the people that we work with across the country. What does a framework of youth engagement start to look like in communities, and how can we grow that 20% to 50% in the next 10 years? And one of the biggest, obviously, is realistic funding models. And then infrastructure. Training is huge. We train for our educators, but we actually don't train for artists and community. But we have been talking to communities in NASCAD, in Nova Scotia. They're actually putting grad students in rural communities for a year. Half time on their own practice, half time in community. So there's been a lot of growth there. And then, yeah, what it should look like. And even talking to the librarian today, there's a push for maker spaces in communities. So, you know, when you look at a community and say, what are the spaces and how can each space grow? Because that entry point, kids are comfortable. I've seen communities where they're just comfortable coming to the library, right? And then give them some cameras, and then suddenly they're connecting over to other organizations in the community. And then the blueprint of how do we make it happen. And we do have a couple of models out there, and I don't know if any of you are terribly aware of municipal cultural planning. And the word, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so as most municipalities in their like second or third round, the thing was I did sit on it, municipal cultural planning, to ensure that youth were there. I've read so many cultural plans across the province, and youth are there in a small tokenized. In London, Ontario, it was one sentence: expand art and education. You know, that was it. So, but we do have that model of how do we go back and do mapping and do all of those things and write strategic plans. But we can also look at the sport model. So once one arena was built, you know, the next town needed to have that. And I have to have faith in that. And we have built capacity that we did not have 20 years ago in terms of youth arts leaders and people like Clayton. And, you know, there's just a wealth of them, Ruth Howards, that Phyllis Novaks, that can go out and work with communities in community development. And then also then we have to push the 3 levels of government. And the mayor this morning, you know, talked about it as being part of a legacy, but it really should be in municipal budgets. I mean, I don't know how many, you know, I did the numbers, and really on a per capita basis, we could get $25 split between federal, municipal, and provincial, plus revenue generation. Otherwise, that would do it. I mean, that would do it enormously. I think for sport and rec, that number is actually close to $75 a person per capita per year. So I just need to go, but I'm going to hand this around. I'm really doing a push right now to sort of implement the UN Rights of the Child for Canada Article 31B and get it legislated. And I met with the PMO's office, Prime Minister's office. Right now they're putting the youth policy together, and they need to hear from as many of the youth artists. And so they're asking, and so she asked me if, you know, any locally could get some youth together, 2-hour session, film it, and upload it, and I've got all of that information onto their website. So I have lots of these. But then also, you know, email me, because we're starting now to build the list. But I've been meeting with senators, and I've been meeting with different ministries, and very much there suddenly is starting to be a very large amount of funding as of January specific to you. So
do you have your email in here so we can get in contact with you?
I think it's in there, yeah. So anyway, there you go. Yes, Clayton?
Thanks. I wanted to bring up that, so we've worked together lots over the years, but it's like that same idea of how like you engage with youth, and then they go to college and they're busy, and then they get jobs in the industry and they're busy. And for the people that that works with them at the early stages, we actually have it's like we have to hound them and chase them around to get them to even respond, say like, oh, could you throw a shout out that, you know, hey, this was your first job, and now you're the head of this organization or something? Exactly. Could you do that? Because no one knows these things. And organizationally, the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, we're now starting to look at like when I build a project platform, like project budget, that we like take a subsection of marketing to be like follow-up marketing. Oh, great. And like it's artist fees to have them respond, because if we don't pay for their time like a year later, they're like impossible to track down.
Yeah, no, that's really important.
Well,
And,
it's
yeah.
mandatory because, like you said, otherwise it's just like there's no evidence that they were ever there.
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly. And somebody said to me last night, you know, as a challenge getting the word up to higher levels of policy. No, that's been done. They're get it. We're seeing arts funding into grants, you know, with justice or places I never would have seen. Where the challenge really is at the front lines right here in communities. You need to talk to your MPs, MPPs. You need to talk to your mayors. They need to see that youth voice saying we want this, and that's what's going to tip this back. Yeah, it's 5 minutes after 12.
That's really good. Thank you.